Hi, this is Chris Daniels, and this is a video for artist management having to do with taxes and what independent musicians oftentimes have to deal with. Most of us who are independent musicians hold down a bunch of jobs. Oftentimes we have a day job, sometimes called a job, and from that we get a W-2. And that's a pretty simple document that looks kind of like this. Most of you all are pretty familiar with that. And W-2 just basically says where you work. I work for the University of Colorado, and I am not an independent contractor with the University of Colorado. I'm an employee, which means that they take out withholding for everything from federal tax to Medicare to all the kinds of things that you see on a W-2. Now, if you had a band that was structured in a way that wasn't independent contractors, where you had created a corporation and each one of the band members was an employee of that corporation, then you would use this W-2, and it's a whole different thing. But I'm going to assume, like most people right now, that you're an independent contractor, that you work for maybe more than one band, or that if you're an artist manager, that you're managing an act that works for more than one band or doing one thing. And if you're that manager, you're going to have to deal with these forms too. It's also the same for venues. We'll talk about that at the end of this little tape. But I have a band, and the band is called Chris Daniels and the Kings, and I've formed a company, and that company is an LLC, which means that it's basically a partnership and a corporation put together. And it's a pass-through. Any money that comes to me from playing gigs basically goes through the company to the various players. And there's 7 players in the band. So if I get a gig, I'll usually get something like this. I'll get a contract. This one is from Blue Moon Talent, which is a talent agency. And they've hired me to do a gig for a company. Now in this case, the Blue Moon Talent agency is going to pay me. So along with the contract, they're going to send me one of these, a W-9. And the W-9 just collects tax information that they're going to use at the end of the year. They get this form from the federal government, but they don't send this form to the federal government. Blue Moon Talent sends this form to me. I fill it out with my company name, Chris Daniels and the Kings, LLC, my address, and a thing called an EIN number, which stands for Employer Identification Number. It's a tax number. And when I created my band, I created the LLC, and I put all the documents together for that agreement. And then what I did was I asked my lawyer, wonderful character, who got me a tax number. And it was actually my lawyer that did it. It's very simple. And so instead of putting my social security number here, because my company, Chris Daniels and the Kings, is playing for Blue Moon Talent, I put my company tax number on this. All right, so we play the gig, have a great time. The gig is in March of 2013. Time passes. The end of the year comes. And now Blue Moon Talent, these guys, have a requirement that they must fulfill to the federal tax group, the IRS. And they have to report the amount of money that they paid out, and they have to give me a document saying, this is how much money we gave you. At the same time, my company, the band, Chris Daniels and the Kings, I also have to do the same thing. And we use 2 documents to do that. We use a 1099 and a 1096. So I'm going to talk about the band itself. So during the year, I've kept track of every single gig that we played. I use a simple Excel program. And in that program, I say, okay, Joe and Jane and my DJ and Sue all played all of these gigs. And this was the gross that we made. That's what came in from Blue Moon Talent. And that's what each one of us individually made. So I've kept track of that during the year. And at the end of the year, I'm going to use all of that information to fill in one of these, a 1099. And it's going to go to each one of the players in my band. Now, because the players in my band and I are friends, I can ask them for their tax information. I don't necessarily need to get, at the beginning of the year, a W-9 from them, because we can talk about it. But Blue Moon Talent will have used that W-9 to create this 1099 tax document that they send me. So here it is. Blue Moon Talent is going to use that W-9 information, and they're going to fill in this 1099 and say, Chris Daniels and the Kings, LLC made, let's make up a number, $700. There's 7 players in the band. So on this form, it's going to say $700 came to Chris Daniels and the Kings. Well, now I kept track all year long of how much everybody made. We each made $100 a piece on that gig, plus all of these other gigs. So at the end of the year, I'm going to use this information to send a 1099 to each one of my band members, saying we made $100 at the Blue Moon gig and another $100 at this gig, and I put them all together, and it's got to be more than $600, and I'll put it here for all of those gigs. So my band members make, let's pretend they make $50,000 a year. So they're going to get a 1099 from me saying they made $50,000. I'm going to actually give one to myself because I'm just a band leader and we are an LLC, and it's going to say I made $50,000. Okay, so now we got all that. That has to happen, by the way, in January of the year after you did that. So I did remember this gig in June of 2013. So by the end of January, I'm going to have sent out that 1099 to all my band members, and Blue Moon is going to have sent me the 1099. Now, by the end of February, both my company, Chris Daniels and the Kings, and Blue Moon are required to fill out this. It's called the 1096 red copy. And the 1096 red copy basically at the front says, here's my company, Chris Daniels and the Kings. Here's the person who's filling out the form, Chris Daniels. Here's the EIN number that we used all year for Chris Daniels and the Kings. And there were 7 musicians that all got a 1099 from my company, Chris Daniels and the Kings. And so I'm going to send this form to the IRS. This is the only form that goes to the IRS, and I will attach each one of my band members' 1099s to the back of it. So it'll be this form along with the 1099s. That's the only time I send stuff to the IRS. So that's done. Goes out. By the way, Blue Moon is going to do the same exact thing. So Blue Moon is going to have kept track of all the times they paid Chris Daniels and the Kings. And maybe I worked for them 5 times in the year. And I made $700 each time. So $3,500. They're going to send me that 1099 for $3,500. And then they're going to fill out a 1096 copy that says Blue Moon. And it's going to say however many, maybe they hired 60 bands. And they'll say, we hired $60,000 worth of bands. And one of those bands was Chris Daniels and the Kings, and we paid them $3,500. And that's the one document they are going to send to the IRS. All right, time passes and we come to April. Now it's time for me, Christopher, to fill out my individual tax form. So I get that good old 1040 tax form. And don't let this fool you. This 2010 is just the year that this tax form came from. So here's the 1040 tax form. And I'm going to attach to it both the W-2 that I got from the university and the 1099 that I got from my band. And I'm going to send that in, and the first page is going to say, this is where my income was. Here's all the money I made. I made this much money from the band and this much money from the university. Now, like any good musician, I had expenses. I had strings, a couple of my guitars broke, had to get those fixed. I had hotel rooms at various out-of-town gigs. car rental at some of the gigs we went to, expenses for all the different stuff. Now for me, that's going to be my personal expenses. And that's going to subtract what I made here. In other words, let's say I made $50,000 from the university and from Chris Daniels and the Kings combined. But on here, what's called the 1040 Schedule C, I'm going to put those expenses. So it reduces the amount of money that I made and shows that my actual income after I paid for strings and gas and hotel rooms was much less. Instead of $50,000, I spent $10,000 on gas and hotel rooms and strings and all that. So now my liability, tax liability to the IRS, is actually $40,000. So those are the forms. Now let's look at some other possibilities that I might include. Well, what happens if I'm a studio musician, and I am, and I go play for a studio, a recording studio? Well, a recording studio might do the exact same thing. I might start out by sending me the W-9 that I fill out, and then at the end of the year, they say Chris Daniels, and that would be me personally, not my band. And so they would use, instead of an employment identification number, they'd use my personal social security number. They'd send this to me. So I'd have a 1099 coming from the recording studio. And the recording studio would do just what we talked about. They'd file a 1096 saying we paid all of these, we had 60 studio musicians come in, and we paid them all. And they'd send in the 1096 in February. And I would combine not only this 1099 and my W-2, but also the 1099 that I got from the recording studio when I did my taxes. And maybe I made $1,000 from the recording studio as an individual musician. Well, I had expenses driving to the recording studio. So I had $50 in gas because the studio was up in Fort Collins round trip, and I went up there 2 times. So then I'm going to first record that income, and then I'm going to write off that gas on the Schedule C. With a venue, it's pretty similar, but again, it's slightly different. So for a venue owner, if I own a great venue called Hot Jazz, and I hire a band, I'm going to send out some kind of a contract. I'm an employer then to the band. Let's say I hire a band called Crazy DJ. Well, I might send Crazy DJ this, and I'm also going to send Crazy DJ that W-9 we talked about. Because I need to know that information from Crazy DJ at the end of the year, because I have to say, Crazy DJ was not an employee of mine. He was an independent contractor who came and played at my club. So then at the end of the year, just like everything else we've talked about, I'm going to send a 1099 to Crazy DJ saying he came and played my club. And shortly after that, I'm going to include that 1099 along with all of the other bands that I hired during the year with the 1096 form, send that into the federal government saying, see, I hired 60 bands, and here's all of their 1099s. Pardon me. So that's basically the idea. I hope this was helpful.